The US announced a 10-day ceasefire agreement in Lebanon on Wednesday, saying that a pause in hostilities would allow Israel and Lebanon to work to create conditions for lasting peace. It follows initial contact between the Lebanese and Israeli ambassadors to Washington earlier this week. Now, US President Trump reportedly plans to invite the leaders of both countries to the White House for further talks. Many Lebanese hope that the agreement will bring an end to a month and a half of war that has killed over 2,000 people and displaced well over 1 million. Yet the outlook is uncertain. Despite the truce being formally in effect, Israel has continued to strike targets in Lebanon, as well as demolishing villages along the country's southern border. Israel's government is demanding that Lebanon's military disarm Hezbollah, something the army's chief has repeatedly said it cannot do. Yet President Trump is eager to tout the truce as a win, as the future of diplomacy between Washington and Tehran remains uncertain. The two parties are expected to meet again for talks in Islamabad, although no date has been set as of yet. So, what does this ceasefire actually mean for Lebanon? And how could it determine Hezbollah's future? To find out, I am speaking to Hicham Safieddine, Canada Research Chair in the History of the Modern Middle East and Associate Professor of History at the University of British Columbia. Hicham, thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with the most recent news of this ceasefire agreement that was announced by the US on Wednesday. What do you make of the terms of this agreement?
This agreement, or I should say this statement issued by the Department of State, comes on the heels, as you mentioned, of an Israeli war that has killed more than 2,100 people in the last 6 weeks only, that has destroyed over 40,000 housing units. That's almost 1,000 housing units a day. This demolishment of homes and villages and heritage centers is part and parcel of the ongoing genocidal war and war of ethnic cleansing and the application of the Gaza doctrine to some extent on southern Lebanon. If we take that into account and we look at the terms of this truce, this is actually a statement of full capitulation and surrender of sovereignty by the Lebanese government. If we compare the content of these terms issued by the White House and declared to be approved, by the way, according to the White House, by the Lebanese government and the Israeli government, we see that they are worse than not only the cessation of hostilities that was agreed on in November 2024, they are even worse, I dare say, than the so-called March 17 peace agreement between Lebanon and Israel all the way back in 1983. And let me explain why this is the case. Firstly, these terms that were issued yesterday, they grant Israel the right to the inherent right to self-defense while making no such mention of Lebanon, something that was actually present even in the 1983 agreement and in the 2024 agreement. The second dangerous point about these terms is actually they make no mention of the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Lebanon or from territories occupied, whether in this latest war since March 2nd or since the war began in September of 2024. In the November 24 agreement, we had such a statement, even though the Israelis were given 60 days to implement it, during which, by the way, they destroyed more property than they had done during the war. A third point that we have to mention is that this agreement very oddly states that Lebanon and Israel are no longer at war. As a matter of fact, this is something that the Lebanese parliament can only decide on. And this is something that is unprecedented at a time of ongoing Israeli war. So the terms, at least as they come out of the White House, are not, I would be very cautious to think that these terms are going to actually lead to some sort of I wouldn't say peace, but at least at a minimum, an end to current hostilities. And maybe we can talk more about why this truce happened in the first place, which is in fact much more to do with the events on the ground and much less to do with the Lebanese government's position, which so far has been very capitulatory.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because there seems to be this discord between, these grand American and Israeli statements about a peace for generations and, the Israeli ambassador to Washington talking about, tourist visits and visiting in bathing suits and so on. And there seems to be a disconnect between all this fanfare around these meetings and around this direct contact, as opposed to the reality on the ground, which is, as you so clearly outlined, which has been a devastating war, the evacuating the population up to the Litani River, these mass demolitions of housing, many permanently displaced Lebanese. So does it seem like this is, as you noted, rather than being a real agreement between two sovereign entities, as you said, more of just a surrender document or a kind of capitulation? And if so, surely that will hinder the ability of the Lebanese government to be able to follow through on that and to justify it to its own population, I imagine.
As a matter of fact, since the beginning of this war, we've heard, and I'm speaking from Lebanon right now, there has been a lot of mobilization, civil society in the positive sense of the term, mobilization by groups that come from different backgrounds, not simply those attached to Hezbollah, who are extremely upset and angry at the way in which the Lebanese government and the president of Lebanon, rather than capitalize on the current connection between the Lebanese front and the Iranian front, regardless of whether they agree or disagree with Iran's position, they have been doing the opposite. They are actually trying to dissociate the two fronts in a manner that undermines Lebanese ability to leverage any gains in the front line, in the battlefield, in order to improve the conditions of a ceasefire with Israel. We are still very far from, firstly, on the popular level, we know that, the Lebanese people are divided. We have to admit that. There is unfortunately a good number of, or a large social base that wants to have some sort of surrender agreement with the Israelis, or normalization, let's put it that way, to normalize with Israel. But that's partly also a function of the media and of the Lebanese government's position and of the presence of certain political parties that are still harboring the same illusions and dreams they had in the 80s of actually normalizing with Israel. So you're right to point out that we have a divergence today between the position of the Lebanese government and a good base of the population. And we don't know where this will lead. It certainly is going to create more internal strife. And this is in the interest of Israel. Israel is trying hard to actually foment some form of, if not civil war, then civil strife and sectarian confrontations. And we can talk about the chances of that, but this is what the Lebanese government is doing. And it's extremely dangerous, because also this means that there's no coordination between who is fighting, who is resisting, and who is negotiating. Not to mention, of course, lastly, the image that this is projecting to the world, that while the people of Lebanon are being slaughtered by the Israelis, the Lebanese government is sending emissaries to take photo ops in Washington, largely also supported by Zionists in Washington. We also have a so-called lobby, Zionist Lebanese lobby, that is also doing its bidding to push for this normalization agenda.
I will note that, as you mentioned, Lebanese society is incredibly divided. And I'm sure many who may be in favor of a peace agreement, or no matter how capitulatory it is, are likely coming from a position of fatigue with war and with Israeli attacks, rather than necessarily an embrace of Israel, even if that's what the terms of the agreement may amount to. But I'm interested in what you said about likelihood of civil strife. I wonder if this is kind of, in addition to the military track, this is another form of social, economic, political pressure that Israel is hoping to apply on Hezbollah, as opposed to just military pressure. We've had this mass displacement of 1.25 million people in the country. Obviously, a lot of these Shia populations who are, now going northward. We've seen a lack of the reconstruction of villages in the south. Do you see an attempt in this moment to socially, politically try and isolate Hezbollah and press their advantage while they can?
Let me begin by saying that the people that are most fatigued and distraught by the war are the displaced Southerners. And most of them are not calling at all for any kind of normalization with Israel. As a matter of fact, they are calling for the exact opposite. Sometimes they are on the left of Hezbollah. They are like, we are sick and tired of this. We will not accept normalizing with an entity that is trying to actually exterminate us. Some of this fatigue obviously can exist among some people, but this is also a function of the media that is constantly focusing on these aspects. And as a matter of fact, there is no fatigue from civil strife. There is no fatigue from sectarianism, but somehow there's fatigue from resisting occupation. Unfortunately, we are next to a state or entity that is a settler colony. We do not choose this war. Most Lebanese, I understand the fatigue, but as a matter of fact, like any other struggle historically, we don't have a choice. Most people do not have a choice because the Israelis have left no choice. Even the Palestinians have, at some point accepted a two-state solution. And yet, look at the West Bank, what's happening in the West Bank. So this idea that resistance is the cause of the lack of peace is itself, I think, inaccurate and maybe confusing to some people. This is not to say that many people would like, of course, an end to the war, but under what terms? Does a cessation of hostilities secure? Does normalizing secure peace? If Israel still has expansionist aims, if Israel wants to subjugate economically Lebanon, or if Israel wants to actually deny the right of return of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, these are all important questions to raise. To your second point, you're absolutely right that the Israelis, when they fail on the ground to themselves basically vanquish the resistance, they seek to create this political windfall. And this is what they're trying to do, to constantly isolate, insulate the social base of Hezbollah, and also to create a huge rift between the Lebanese government and these factors. Now, this is a double-edged sword, because in Lebanon, the sectarian makeup of Lebanon, on one hand, it can create a lot of space for foreign intervention and for sectarian strife. On the other hand, for anything to become constitutional in the non-legal sense, in the political legitimate sense, you cannot exclude an entire sect. So this is why it's difficult to somehow just wish the Shias away, for example, and still claim that you have some sort of, we call mithaqiyya, some form of legitimacy of the government. So it's a two-way street.
Do you think their approach is, sure, we'll talk, so that they can turn around and say, look, we tried this, we told them to disarm Hezbollah, they couldn't, so now we have to go in and we have to maintain an occupation south of the Litani? I mean, you mentioned before kind of a repeat of Gaza policy, where they try to achieve in diplomacy what they haven't in war, which is to disarm their opponent. And so the freezing of that situation essentially means, well, we have to have a buffer zone, and we're just going to push this group further and isolate them further, cut them off from reconstruction, and just kind of stay there until something changes. Well, what do you think do you think that's too cynical a reading? What do you think is the calculation there?
So maybe we can think of each party's take on this. The Israelis, you're right. The Israelis, who I think should be disarmed. It's interesting what our disarming Hezbollah. We need to disarm Israel, not fighters who are resisting with still, minimal weaponry to occupation. But that position aside, if you want to take real politics, the Israelis have constantly, used these pretexts to either create a buffer zone. This is dating all the way back to the 1948 war, then the 1967 war, in which Lebanon did not participate, and yet the Israelis grabbed more land. This also obviously applies to Syria after the fall of the Assad regime, when the Israelis also occupied land without any provocation. So these excuses are always there. The interesting question is, what is the reaction of Hezbollah and the Lebanese government to these claims? So if the Israelis, for example, refuse to withdraw now and say, we need this buffer zone, we're not going to withdraw. If the Israelis refuse to go back to pre-November 2024 and say, if we observe any movement in Lebanon that we think in our mind is undermining our security, we have the right to attack it, these would be violations of the terms that Hezbollah has put for itself for this war. So this means that we are likely, especially the second one, which says freedom of movement, freedom of action of Israel in Lebanon. If this continues, I am willing to bet that the resistance will have to respond. Otherwise, it loses its justification for this war, because this is saying, despite all you did, we're back to what we were like before November 2024. As for the Lebanese government will probably try to leverage whatever the Iranian negotiations and the resistance accomplishments on the ground is in order to improve the conditions of its negotiations. That's in principle what it should be doing. My guess is if the Israelis do not withdraw, they're going to have a higher demand on the Lebanese government. So they're going to say, if we're going to withdraw, we want full so-called peace arrangements. So the Israelis will always have the pretext. Our question now is, after today, two things maybe. Will Israel violate, and if it does, in what manner? Will the resistance respond to the violations, regardless of what the Lebanese government says? And thirdly, are we going to see a reconvergence of Iranian-Lebanese negotiations after what happened? Or are we going to see a further divergence because of Lebanese, Israeli, and American actions?
On that point about how closely the Iranian and Lebanese tracks will remain tied, we've seen in this kind of war of words between Iranian and Lebanese officials, one of the advisors to Khamenei saying that, Mr. Nawaf Salam, the Lebanese prime minister, must know that ignoring the role of the resistance will expose Lebanon to irreparable security risks, and that the stability of Lebanon lies solely in the synergy between the government and the resistance. That was kind of perceived by some as a warning that, trying to decouple Lebanon from the Iran track would come with consequences. Lebanon has also ramped up its actions against Iran. It said it would expel the Iranian ambassador. That ambassador has at present refused to leave, but the expulsion is still there. How do you read these exchanges? How far do you think Iran is willing to go?
So the Lebanese government and the presidency has claimed that it wishes to implement a policy of neutrality ever since it came to power. Contrary to this claim, it has actually switched its allegiance totally into the camp of Israel, the United States, and its Gulf allies. And as a matter of fact, as you mentioned, while accepting sometimes unacceptable policy positions by the United States, including the delegate Tom Barak calling everybody animals, it's actually expelling the Iranian ambassador. Not only that, by the way, it's denying the right of Iranian planes to land in Lebanon. It's also constricting the mobility of many Lebanese who go to make pilgrimage in Iraq or Lebanon. So the Lebanese government itself has actually enacted a very extreme anti-Iranian policy. Now, unlike the former Syrian regime, the Iranians are very diplomatic, so they don't do tit for tat. Generally speaking, they haven't escalated the diplomatic language against the Lebanese government, despite all these measures. Yet, what they're doing is, in fact, they understand very well that if these two paths are completely, separated, then the Lebanese who have put their faith in Iran at this, because let's remember, in the first war, many people were not satisfied with the Iranian response. Today, if the Iranians do not stick to their promise to continue to support the Lebanese front, not the government, the Lebanese people, especially of South Lebanon, it might undermine actually this alliance. And so I think this point is saying to the Lebanese government, we are giving you this so you could possibly use it as leverage. Don't waste the opportunity and actually do the exact opposite. And they're also sending a message to their allies that no matter what your government does, we are going to continue to stand by you. Now, here's the point is, we have mixed results so far. We had an initial divergence when the ceasefire happened in Iran, not in Lebanon. Then we had a reconvergence, although now it's being billed as not. And then we're going to see after the end of the 2 weeks or the 10 days, are we going to see further reconsolidation of these fronts or a divergence?
Despite that, Prime Minister Nawaf Salam is still kind of remaining insistent and pursuing this path. I wonder, though, is there a point at which, his promises to Israel and his commitments to this diplomatic track simply collapse on touch with reality? We know that there's been tensions between himself and the chief of the Lebanese armed forces over the mere fact that they've insisted time and time again the army cannot be expected to disarm Hezbollah. Do you see at some point that this endeavor simply reaches a breaking point? And if so, what happens then? Do we see A collapse of the government, a return to war? How do you see this going?
So the first point about the army, you're right that in order to foment civil war, civil strife, there is a push to put the army, in front of to confront Hezbollah. So far, the chief of the army has been very wise and has refused to do so, even though the Lebanese army itself, while being egged on to actually disarm Hezbollah, is actually withdrawing and not confronting the Israeli occupation forces. So here we go again to the question of sovereignty, this surrender, this further surrender of sovereignty in Lebanon to the American party. Nawaf Islam is trying to square the circle by constantly, issuing these statements of empathy and condemning sometimes, every once in a while, Israeli aggression, but doing everything that actually is in the opposite direction. He's been, to compensate, for example, for the lack of action by the Lebanese army, he's called for so-called make Beirut a safe space, so that you can, disarm whatever military presence there is in Beirut. The government is increasingly becoming unpopular and its position is becoming increasingly untenable in relation to facts on the ground. But the complication is because of the sectarian system. In Lebanon, this is to your second question about what's going to happen to the government. The government, there's two ways basically to overthrow the government democratically. The first is through parliamentary, no vote of confidence. But we just had 2 months ago, the Lebanese parliament extended its tenure for 2 more years. So it canceled the elections. So that's no longer a possibility. The second possibility is to go back to my point about all sectarian elites have to be, there's been consensus on major decisions, and that can be violated if any sect withdraws all its ministers. Now, the Shia ministers, they are 5. One of them is a kind of like a wild card. And he's the one who I should tell the viewers that the Lebanese government already criminalized resistance in the past. But every time this minister, who's probably the liaison between the head of parliament, Nabih Berri, and the president, is inside the cabinet meeting, which kind of makes it harder to undermine the constitutionality of a government position. We are left with the public pressure to eventually bring down the government. But that again has to also mean that Salam is willing to listen to the people, which I don't think at this point is going to happen. So we are entering a very shaky period in Lebanon. And the more this divergence happens, like the 1980s, I don't want to make too much comparison, but by the way, back then, the government was on one side signing a normalization agreement, and the resistance forces that were not just Islamic, they were, leftist, secular, were on the other side. They were not part of the government like today. But eventually we had the assassination of the president of Lebanon before the treaty. And then we had something called the February uprising. In the February uprising, people revolted against the presence of the Lebanese military. At the time, the Lebanese military was fully in the pocket of the Israel's allies in Lebanon. And this led, and then we had the Marine barracks bombings. And so we had many events that kind of put a break on what the Lebanese are. So I don't know how this is going to play out today, but I expect if they don't put brakes and if the performance of the resistance improves on the ground, they're going to have to readjust, or we are heading to tearing apart of the Lebanese political system or structure, being pulled by different directions by different parties.
Do you see this as perhaps the most, you called it shaky, unstable moment since then? And do you worry about history repeating itself?
I am worried. I still think that we haven't gotten there yet. There's still a lot to happen, including we talked about the army's position. We talked about the performance in the south. We talked about, by the way, a lot of Lebanese are also not wanting to repeat the civil war. We've had relatively a high level of support and hospitality of the Lebanese, despite things to the contrary here and there, because I've also been on the ground and I've worked with relief efforts and I've seen the level of solidarity that exists. But I think the problem is with the elites of the ruling elite, the ruling class, which is, across our Arab region. we quite often we have these ruling classes who are willing to act on behalf of these foreign powers and sometimes willing to egg their people on to civil strife. So my other hope, of course, is that the Islamabad track or whatever is happening regionally will also put a brake on the Israeli and American designs, because transferring the contradiction or the confrontation from resistance to occupation and regional liberation to internal strife is a very dangerous shift. So we have to do everything to reshift it back into the external threat, which is currently, of course, still very present and clear.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Hicham. It's been a pleasure.